Well, let's welcome our viewers to another roundtable discussion today with Stacy Costopoulos Smith and Andrea Morinoue. Sorry, Andrea, almost messed up
It's all
your name.
right. Nobody gets it right. Okay.
Yeah, and Jussi Light, who gets that right? So here we are. Nice to see you, ladies.
You too.
Yeah, and what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about anxiety and PTSD. Two kinds of problems that we get a lot of questions about, and we have an awful lot of our clients that are suffering in some form of this, whether they know it or not. And so today we're going to talk about, like, what are those differences? Like, what's the difference between anxiety and PTSD, especially because we live in a world filled with anxieties. I think we all know that you can walk down a certain street and feel anxious, or you can be driving on a freeway and feel anxious, or if there's a hurricane approaching, you can feel anxious. And everyone kind of understands that, you know. There are certain things that are common to the human condition that are frightening and concerning, and so we feel like anxiety, but no one really thinks of that as strange and unusual, right? Yeah. So today, I think what we're going to really focus on is when it gets outside of that normal bound. And for example, we hear people say, like, oh, you know, they'll call us on the phone, they'll say, you know, my husband has anxiety, or my kid suffers from anxiety. And we just automatically know, because it's part of the language, right, that there's something more than what's maybe normal. So I thought maybe we could start with that. Yeah. And yeah, okay. So how about we start with you, Andrea? Are you good with that? And
Sure.
Sort of talk about, like, how you understand anxiety when a client calls and says that. What's your understanding there?
Yeah. Well, to go back to your point, I think sometimes there's actually some confusion about what is normal anxiety and what's not. And so if there is somebody calling and they're having a very kind of normal relationship with anxiety over something that's happening currently, that's something that I'd want to figure out. And just support the fact that this is a normal reaction to something that's occurring. You know, that would be the first thing that I would look at. But then also just to think of anxiety in the way that, you know, what we know of that is just that overwhelming feeling that we have, that we can't function in the same way that maybe we would function without that feeling. So that's one of the things that triggers me in thinking that there would be abnormal anxiety levels. And then also this negative belief that if certain things are happening, then this is going to happen. And that can be really complex sometimes. But I would say when I think something is out of the realm of typical anxiety, it tends for me to feel like it's something that doesn't feel controllable. You know, where it's your head is spinning, you can't stop ruminating. There are feelings and thoughts that feel really uncomfortable, and you can't settle down. I would say that would be something I would be looking at.
Right, that's really good. That loss of control, that kind of thing that happens on the inside, that like we can barely control what goes on out there, but we like to think we can control what goes on inside of ourselves. And you're talking about that loss of control to a fear or a worry, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And sometimes that actually looks like a lot of anger too. Sometimes anxiety looks like pretty severe anger is what I've noticed.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'd like to come back to that one. But I want to give you a chance, Stacy, to weigh in on kind of how you see what we're starting to talk about here. Maybe even when people mention like an anxiety disorder or someone has anxiety, would you add anything to what you've heard Andrea saying?
Yeah, I love all the points that Andrea was making. I so agree that there are going to be times in life where we are going to feel some anxiety, and that anxiety is there for a good reason. It's letting us know that we're apprehensive. We're kind of anticipating that something might be uncomfortable or bad or dangerous or something like that. And the hope is that we, as we develop into adulthood, can gain tools and skills for how to work with that in life so that we can put it in its proper place, give it the proper attention that it needs, and then close the door on it and move on to the next part of life, whatever that might be. But when it turns into, that kind of phrase like, oh, my wife has anxiety and it's really hard for me because she has anxiety, or we notice somebody else that we love has anxiety and we want to get them help or something like that, that usually means that it's bled over and it's affecting our functioning in some way. So there's a difficulty in being able to close the door on it and move on to something else. And it really ties into what you were saying, Andrea, about the control piece, how sometimes we're just not able to manage it with control. And then because of the nature of anxiety, that kind of like always anticipating, it can spin out of control and just like snowball a little bit. And pretty soon it becomes a part of our unconscious functioning, and we carry it through to different aspects of our life. And then after a while, people start to suffer and they don't even know why. It's hard to connect those dots, that there might be an underlying anxiety that's showing up in one realm of life that might have a source in a different realm of life. And so that's where we can put some treatment plans into effect to help uncover what that process has been for a client and kind of walk beside them in understanding it, helping them to be able to get those tools to manage it.
Good stuff. So one of the things I'm taking away here is that people who are trying to understand anxiety and like, do I have normal anxiety or is it something that's beyond normal, is to ask themselves, is this something I can control within reason, within myself? Like, can I calm myself down when I know I ought to be calm, but I feel this thing inside of me? Is there something that I can do to shut the door, as you say, or get some control, as you say, Andrea? And I think as I listen, the impression I have is that there is something about being stuck. There's a way that we all understand that, when the hurricane is coming, we're anxious about it and we're boarding up the house and going for higher ground and all that. But when it passes and we discover that all is well, our anxiety usually should go away. We shouldn't continue to remain afraid of an oncoming hurricane that's passed through. And if we can't for some reason, then we would say that we're stuck there. And I hear you guys saying like, that's when treatment can be helpful, because we want to get curious about why maybe someone is stuck, which probably is a great segue to the next part of this when we start to talk about PTSD. And for those watching, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a really well-developed phrase because it happens after a trauma. It's post. And it's a traumatic stress. And it's considered a disorder because those who came up with the word sense that you have to wait 6 months to develop it, according to the DSM, we're up to 5R by now. And it develops at 6 months. So I guess the view is if you are still stuck dealing with the fear after a severe trauma 6 months later, then you've got this disorder. I wonder, let's start with you, Stacy, and then we'll come back over to you, Andrea. You want to talk about this at all? I know that you work a lot with trauma survivors, as do you, Andrea. Could you talk a little bit more about how that term is being used and how people sort of throw it around? And even,
totally. Yeah, it does get thrown a lot around. And I think that term was first kind of coined in the 80s, right? After studies on Vietnam vets who had this kind of presentation where they were really, really suffering as a result of traumas that they experienced in a war zone, combat or in some kind of severe danger, or some, severe witnessing of people being endangered. And the term then PTSD became really popular, and now it does kind of get thrown around, and people will use it usually to indicate that they really notice that someone is suffering in some way, and they realize that it came from some traumatic event. So the DSM-5 has a whole list of criteria that actually need to be made, or they actually need to be present in order to gain the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And you're right, you see, it's one of those is that a life-threatening or perceived life-threatening event has to have taken place in the individual's life, or someone that they love, someone that they care about, that they're aware that their loved one was put in danger, life-threatening danger. But there are also other kinds of things like vicarious trauma that are included in this picture, and that could come from law enforcement officers who witness people that they don't know continually being put in harm's way, or children, or firefighters can also develop these symptoms. So even if you don't meet all of the necessary criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD, that doesn't mean that you are not suffering post-traumatic stress. So some of those symptoms, what could they be? One of the things that's different from normal anxiety, or like a more disordered anxiety where it's interrupting your functioning in life, could be something that's called a symptom of intrusion, which is what's more commonly known as like a flashback. And in those situations, the person who is exposed to that trauma, who never had a chance to really process that event through, their whole body physiologically is kind of overcome with the same sensations and fears and tensions that they may have had during that event.
So it's like they like relive it,
yeah,
even though it's past.
Absolutely, right.
Right.
Yeah.
Flashback really means that you go back and experience some of the emotion, and it's debilitating because yeah,
exactly, right. It's really hard to distinguish if we're in the present moment or if we're back in that traumatic event again. That's how powerful our mind is as it's taking in these events where we're really fearing for our lives. Nightmares are also a symptom of PTSD, and those things are nightmares or night terrors are not something that we choose, and they're not something that we can control. And they can be triggered by something that may have happened earlier in the day that we're not even aware of. And before you know it, they can start interrupting sleep, and then we're suffering from sleep deprivation. So that's something that goes outside of the bounds of, feeling anxiety about a job interview that's coming up, or a more debilitating kind of anxiety that's hard to control.
Right.
Yeah, and then there are also like the long-standing beliefs that we tend to build upon if we are experiencing PTSD that doesn't go resolved for a certain amount of time, because we start to build our life view on danger as being the norm, and that can really impact the way that we experience relationships, the way that we feel security in ourselves, the way that we vision our future to be. It can get in the way of goals. Right. So those are a few of the symptoms, but there are a few more. I don't want to dominate here, Andrea, if you want to jump in, or if you have specific things that you see either way.
Yeah, I think when I think of PTSD, a lot of what I think of, that we had talked about a little bit, that it's, used a lot these days. But I think that there's a reason that it's used a lot. It's used a lot because I think we're realizing in mental health, and I know that there's more and more research that's being done about it, but that PTSD isn't solely about someone who has experienced a war zone. I mean, PTSD can be related to somebody who's had a lot of relational trauma. If somebody's been, if there's been sexual assault, and especially if it's happened more than once, that can absolutely create some PTSD. Relational trauma in terms of how we grew up. And if we've been invalidated as a child over and over again, that can create some later PTSD for us. So PTSD to me is a blanket term for something that's so complex, that I think is one of the things that when we're working with it is why it's so important to take it slow and really learn what are these fears that are coming up. Anxiety, like we said multiple times, is really our reaction to fear. And what does that look like? If we're fearful about someone rejecting us, are we fearful about a smell that came up that sent us into panic? Where did that come from? It can be some really mild things that can happen that can send us into a panic or a feeling of being out of control. And I think that's what we're talking about when it's PTSD, is, what you've all talked about, the flashbacks, the sleep disturbances, the intrusive thoughts. And then there's also, I think we haven't really touched on disassociation, which is a really big piece of PTSD to me, because when something is so overwhelming and there's an experience that we've had that is so overwhelming, sometimes our immediate reaction and our brain's healthy reaction is to shut down.
Yeah.
It's just block it out. And so then when we feel those ways moving forward, then our brain naturally shuts down. And so in my opinion, PTSD is us just viewing our health, the way that our brain had a healthy reaction to something that was really intolerable.
Yes, totally.
And now it's just coming back up again in times that we're not actually in danger. And so that's, I think, part of our job as clinicians is figuring out and deciphering, and helping the brain heal to see what's real danger and what's not, because I think there's confusion there with PTSD.
Right. It's really well said. It's like PTSD is listed in the DSM with all the other anxiety disorders. It's considered an anxiety disorder, like a phobia is considered an anxiety disorder, because anxiety is this general feeling of we're under threat and we need to prepare ourselves to protect ourselves, essentially, right? And so when it's mild, the body, the brain naturally mobilizes, but when it's extreme, the body and the brain do things that are extreme also.
Yeah.
So why do we have flashbacks? There's reasons for that, but some people have kind of tried to answer that question. I think that's one of those areas that you have to really spend some time trying to understand. But dissociation makes a lot of sense. Like if I'm going to have my arm sawed off, I'd like to not feel it. So if I can dissociate and not like be in my body in the moment, that's a wonderful gift.
Right.
And so we've discovered that, like you say, PTSD is normal. And now the real question starts to come up when we wonder why some people suffer from PTSD symptoms when others don't. And that kind of speaks to another thing we recorded once upon a time about, like, why is one event traumatic and another event not, or why is one person traumatized by the one event and another person is not traumatized by the same event. And we can sort of talk about that in another video, I think, as we've sort of covered that ground. But I think what I hear you both saying is PTSD and anxiety both have an element of powerlessness, right? There's someone experiences fear and they can't protect themselves to one degree or another. And then their brains cope by sort of, and maybe we could talk about this now. Andrea, I don't know if you want to get into this, but what do we know about what the brain actually does Like, why does the brain hold on to certain smells? For example, the soldier who comes back from Iraq hears the explosion go off and hits the deck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense that the brain would want to remember that explosion and prepare for the next one, right? I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit to know what we know about the brain and PTSD. And
Yeah, the way that I actually view that is implicit and explicit memory.
Could you say a little bit
So
about that? Yeah.
yeah, so implicit memory is really what our body holds and what our body remembers about whatever experience it is that we've had. So we have, like, for instance, younger than 2 years old, really everything from that point on was implicit memory. We don't have an explicit memory, which is something that we could actually bring to our brains and think about and understand and go, oh, that's right. I was here eating dinner with this person, and this is what we talked about. That would be an explicit memory. So to me, PTSD is a reaction to our implicit memory, which is stored in our brain in a very specific place, which is back here in the back of our brain. And it's our reaction to a smell, a sound, anything that triggers us in a way that it doesn't give us enough time to think from this part of our brain. And so that's why in that implicit, where it is in your body, that's why a lot of times we focus in on the body when we're talking about PTSD, because sometimes that's all we can understand about what's going on for us. So I don't know if I clarified the brain aspect of it, but it was my initial reaction to what you were talking about.
Yeah, it's like you're saying that when you go through a trauma, it's so immediate and intense that it happens faster than you can think about it. And so you are bombarded by whatever it is that's going on, and your body is recording what's happening, even though you may not be aware of what it is that's being recorded. It gets imprinted on you, and then you're walking around in life, and a smell or a sound or a situation occurs, and suddenly you feel panicked and you don't even know why, but you believe that you're in danger.
Right.
And we
Yes.
want to normalize for people that if anyone is suffering from that, their brain is working well and there's really nothing wrong with them. But it's this anomaly that makes it's like the Matrix, right? Like, what's reality? Am I in reality, or am I in some non-reality? For those who enjoy the Keanu Reeves classic movie. PTSD sufferers feel they are in a kind of extreme danger that outside observers would look and go, I don't think so. And this is one of the great problems for people who have PTSD, isn't it? Because others don't always understand how to validate their extreme reactions.
Yeah.
And it's like you say, it's like their body just feels something and their mind doesn't even understand why. And that disconnect within leaves them kind of weirded out too, but very authentically saying it's dangerous, while others are like, you're nuts. And boy, what that does to relationships, right?
Yeah, and Stacy, I want to give you the floor, but that what you just said made me think of what I had talked about before, which was the anger piece. I think sometimes what happens when we feel that danger is that there is this reaction of anger, because in that moment prior to that, that was the response, and it got what it needed to get. It protected that person. And so it's now anger is their go-to way of coping versus another way, which and there is another way. Their brains just have to readjust to how to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the anger protected them from the danger. And so
Exactly.
when they get triggered, we actually just see anger. We don't realize that they're also feeling some fear.
Exactly.
I gotcha. Sorry, Stacy, go ahead. I bet you've been nodding and I can tell you're tracking all this.
Oh, I am. I love it. I love it. There's so much wonderful conversation happening here. I love the distinguishment between implicit and explicit memory. And I also love, the curiosity about what is that normal process that goes on in the brain, and how do other people experience that if a friend is really being, experiencing the grips of a PTSD symptom, because they don't know how to make sense of it unless they've got the backstory.
Mm-hmm.
And how can they have the backstory if the person who's experiencing it doesn't quite understand it yet? And when we're in that place of not understanding it yet, that's where the opportunity for treatment and healing can be so impactful. It can bring somebody out of that suffering into a place of peace where they're able to do what we call reprocessing of the memory. They're able to identify, like, oh, let's find out what triggered this flashback. Was it a song? Was it, happening to see a car drive by that had some significance that you might not have been aware of? We're able to walk through those steps real slowly in a safe environment with a trusted person. That's where that therapeutic relationship becomes so important. And then the person's able to kind of connect those dots and see, like, oh, yeah, I can identify that it was XYZ factor. That's the last thing I remember before I became just flooded with this sense of dread.
Mm-hmm.
And then my automatic behavior was to avoid, because that's a real key criteria in PTSD presentation too, is that avoidance of something, something associated with whatever event took place. We find ourselves just avoiding stuff without really knowing why we avoid it. That could be an indication that maybe there's an unprocessed traumatic memory in there.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to sit down and understand where it came from, then you can have a better understanding of yourself. And another part of PTSD that I think is really important to give some attention to is the shame that comes with it. Because so often when we experience things about ourselves that we view as different, especially if somebody's telling us, like, dude, you have no reason to freak out right now. We tend to think, oh, okay, well, there must be something wrong with me then, because I am truly freaking out right now, and I don't understand why. So we tend to question ourselves at some point and second guess ourselves and maybe privilege somebody else's opinion about what we should feel over what we really do feel. That can be really confusing and mess with our sense of self. So that shame can also be really intertwined with PTSD. And I think that that's so prominent in our society if you tie back into relational traumatic stress, like you were talking about, Andrea, because we don't often tend to think about those kinds of traumas as traumas. We tend to think more about like the single event traumas, a car accident or an earthquake or something like that, as the real traumas. But when you're talking about an attachment-related fear that a child might have from wondering if they're going to be safe, wondering if they're secure, if they've got a protector when they're fearful, and then that not happening, especially like you said, Andrea, if it becomes repetitive, then we've got a chain of relational traumas that can really have a significant impact on the way we view life, the way we interact with others, and that really is a trauma that can become a PTSD kind of experience. And the more often, like after working with families and relationships and individuals, the more experience that I've had in the role of the listener, the more I believe how devastating those traumas can be too. And they're real, and they deserve to have the attention and the reprocessing and the care that can lead somebody out of that feeling of being trapped.
Well, I'm hearing so many things that just make this a rich discussion. I'm hearing you both talk about sort of the role of the brain in the body and how it tricks us, and our own awareness doesn't understand what's going on, and so we get confused and we can kind of lose ourselves, and and feel very isolated and alone when others don't experience what we're experiencing, and we can feel very invalidated by that. We can also find ourselves reacting in ways that seem normal to us, like anger, but are kind of looked at negatively by others who don't understand like why we're having that reaction. So we can feel misunderstood, and then we can feel a lot of shame, like you were just saying. So there's a lot of sort of side symptoms that come along with untreated anxiety and PTSD. And I say it that way because PTSD includes anxiety. Everything we talked about earlier, part of this is present in PTSD. Avoidance is one big thing. Like people who are anxious about, being in crowds will avoid those crowds, and people who suffer from PTSD will avoid the things that trigger them. Right. And so I think the thing to remember here is that PTSD and anxiety are sort of on a spectrum, where maybe over here we have the normal anxiety that comes, like you're going to go stand up in front of a crowd that you don't know and speak publicly. That's a normal anxiety, and it's very frightening. You can do things about it and you can learn about it, but most people understand that it's real. It's not in your head. It's scary. And then over here, we get into anxiety disorders, where it's like, and phobias, like my son develops a fear of all dogs, where many children love dogs, or, somebody develops a fear of going to, going out shopping, or of germs, or of, social situations. And that doesn't seem quite normal. Although in a pandemic, perhaps it is.
Yeah.
And then in PTSD, we have like these extreme events, right? But if you look at them all, there's that common feeling of something feels scary here, and I can't control it, and I have to face it, and I'm overwhelmed to some extent by those two things happening at once. And my body plays some role in this that I don't understand either. So I sort of betray myself. I sweat when I don't want to sweat. I shake when I don't want to shake. I panic when I don't want to panic, right?
Yeah.
So I think maybe what I hear the discussion moving towards is a little bit more pragmatic stuff, like what is it that brings it on? Like what brings on the anxiety? So maybe, first of all, do you want to say anything to what I've been saying, or should we move into that right now? I said a lot. It's okay to move on,
No, I think you summed it up very well, and I absolutely agree with everything you said.
Okay. Are you comfortable then, like Andrea, like for you, what do you find when people come in and you start to wonder about anxiety and PTSD? Because I know as a clinician, you interview a lot of people, you talk to them, and you start to form theories about like what they might be suffering from. Do you find that it's the environment, or is it like on the inside? Like what brings on the anxiety? Do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, it depends on the person, their situation, if they've had support in their life, if they haven't. I mean, it can, I think it really varies. And so when you think about what brings on anxiety, I feel like that's just such a large, large thing to talk about in a short period of time. But I would say that what I have mostly seen is this relational trauma that has appeared in relationships. So that's where I have probably seen it the most. And I think it's maybe just at the nature of where our practice is and what we do. And I think if I was working in a different facility that was working with veterans, I would see it in a completely different way. So, but that is currently the thing that I see the most is how these relational traumas and how these, being invalidated as a child or being rejected as a child or been compared all during your childhood, and how that can affect the way that we interact with our spouse, the way that we interact with our children. That's, I think, what I'm seeing the most.
Mm. So yeah, because of the nature of the clients that we tend to see here at New Growth, we do see a lot more relational kind of work. So the kinds of anxieties and traumas that you're talking about tend to be formed in the way that people form their first attachments to loved ones, which is in childhood
Mhm.
with parents, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like how you pointed that out, Andrea. And I kept thinking like, yeah, that makes so much sense. And I see that a lot. And one way to kind of differentiate the two that we're talking about is like, if it's easy to see and it makes sense that like, you know, somebody who, we keep on coming back to like the single event car accident, somebody who knows, they are aware, oh, I was in a car accident, and I'm also aware that I really kind of don't like driving on the freeway anymore because it was so terrifying. Well, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. But we can also have these relational traumas that we're not aware that we had.
Mhm.
And so then when we find ourselves being triggered again, we aren't really aware that we're being triggered back to something that happened in the past.
Mm.
And so that leaves us wondering, like when you're asking the question, you see, the first thing that came to my mind is there have been so many times where I'm working with a couple and one of them will start crying, but they don't know why.
Mm.
They don't know why they're crying. And it's obvious to me they're experiencing some profound pain, some profound hurt regarding their, you know, in regards to the relationship they're in now, but it doesn't really gel for them. They can't quite make sense of it, where it's coming from or why. And then there might also be an added element of a belief like, I shouldn't feel this way.
Mm.
And wherever that comes from, that can come from lots and lots of different places, but wherever that comes from, it just further kind of beats us down into that sense of inadequacy or
Yeah.
craziness, or it's my fault, or there's something wrong with me. And that's just one of those really tight knots that needs a lot of time to try to loosen up and pick apart, and that understanding is so key. And it always makes sense in the end, has been
Mm.
my experience of, if you stay, you know, if you trust the process of getting curious about where that came from, and if you allow for the possibility that there might be something in the past that where that's really rooted and anchored, it's always going to make sense in the end. And that's where the relief can come. When people can start to practice an acceptance of that and see it with clarity, and let go of the self-judgment,
Mhm.
it's so freeing. It's so freeing.
Yeah, this is really interesting because my mind keeps going back to those terms, implicit and explicit memory. When you're driving down the freeway and you know that you're feeling uptight about it because you had a collision in your past, that's an explicit kind of an understanding you have. And so you're not a mystery to yourself, right? With
Exactly.
with anxiety and PTSD, the worst kind is when you're having a reaction like that, but you can't figure out why,
Yeah.
and you have to start to dig, and that is pretty much where we make our money, right? That's our bread and butter right there, is walking people into that question. And you know, we have our techniques for how, and maybe in another podcast or whatever video, we're not sure what these things are we? Are these going to be podcasts or video logs? We don't know yet. But at another time, maybe we'll talk about how we use EMDR and internal family systems and the various other methods, emotionally focused therapy, that we have a lot of techniques that we use to deal with those. I wonder if you can maybe start to talk about the beliefs, the conclusions that people start to draw about the nature of reality itself. People who have been through traumas or who have had that sort of long, like Andrea, you kept mentioning, you both have mentioned, like in childhood, if there's a pattern where a child is consistently having a need not be met, it's
Mm-hmm.
wounding, and there's a suffering that goes on, which is like a little miniature trauma that people don't like to name a trauma because it's so commonplace that it's just kind of like everyone has this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that over time, a set of beliefs and conclusions about life, about caregivers,
Right.
begin to develop. And I wonder if we could sort of shift the conversation into the impact that that has.
Yeah, I have I have an example that's been really coming into my mind throughout our whole discussion about my own family that I would love to share
Oh,
if
yeah.
you're okay with that. And this is about my relationship with my daughter. And I don't think she'd mind me sharing this. But if she does, I'll let you know, and we'll have to cut it out of the tape. So she's 24 years old now. But when she was 2, we lived in an apartment for a little while that had a terrible plumbing system in the bathroom. And we had a big black lab dog. She was a really friendly dog, but every now and then the toilet would get clogged up, and then we'd have to call the maintenance man to come fix it. And he would always show up in his uniform, which scared the dog, and he'd always be carrying a plunger. So he came in and, probably 5 or 6 times while we were living at this place. And it was very scary to my daughter to have a strange guy show up at the door and have the dog go insane and have him come into our house and, do a whole bunch of forceful movements in the bathroom and then be on his way. I never realized how traumatic that was to her. So I would just try to distract her and tell her, oh, it's okay. Everything's going to be fine. I knew that we weren't in any danger, but she didn't know that. So in my lack of ability to see her suffering, I wasn't there as a protector in her mind. It wasn't through any intention of mine to neglect her need. I wasn't aware as a parent. And I think that this is such a common phenomenon that we all parents kind of fall into at some point in life. Whether we're the greatest parent in the world or not, we're not always going to be aware of what our children's fears are and how they need to feel protected. So I missed the ball on that one. And what ended up happening was, for the next couple of years, my daughter would not go into a public bathroom if there was a plunger present.
Oh, wow. So there it is. There's the cue, right? The triggering cue is the plunger.
The plunger, the visual of the plunger. And it took me a little while to figure it out, but I finally figured it out. And then, I was like, oh my gosh, I get it. It all makes sense. And that's an example of how having some curiosity and trying to take self-judgment out of the picture can allow for this healing to take place. I could have really anchored down in, oh my God, I'm a bad mom, which I have said to myself many times.
Haven't we all?
Yep.
But it's just kind of a not a terribly traumatic picture to kind of illustrate this process that we're talking about. So I'm happy to share that.
Well, I sure hope your daughter signs off on that piece of
I'll ask her. Get permission. Yeah, her signed consent on that one.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Stacy. I absolutely loved that story, and it was spot on, absolutely. And I think, what I've noticed too, smells are a really big deal for people. That can be a big trigger. Like I have a friend who every time she smells a certain soap in specific hospitals, she gets flooded with the feeling of just immense fear. And it's because she has a lot of trauma around being in hospitals and having to wash her hands. And, to process that and to just at least be able to call it and name it, has been really helpful for her, and for her to be able to say to herself in those moments, everything is okay right now. That I know this is a response to something that happened 5-10 years ago, that everything is okay now.
Yeah.
So empowering. So empowering to be able to get over that hump and shed that stuckness, that powerlessness that you were talking about, you see. Yeah, I fully agree with that.
In a way, as I think about this through, as someone who suffered a snake phobia, when I was a little boy, about 8 years old, I cornered a snake, literally in a corner, and I reached in to get him, and he reared up and bit me.
Whoa.
Yeah. I used to hunt for snakes and catch them and put them down my brother's shirts. So, for me to be afraid of snakes didn't make sense, but I literally lived with that for 30 years. And it's a little easier to look at that. And it's sort of a hybrid. A phobia is sort of a PTSD with something so small and specific that it doesn't interfere much, because how often are you really around snakes? I'm not. Until I moved to the West Coast from an urban setting. So yeah, there's this way in which you can get, and I got over it. And I exposed myself repeatedly to snakes, and I did it the hard way before I knew EMDR. Just like opening books of snakes and looking at the pictures, putting my hand on the picture of the book. Like that was hard for me.
Wow.
Like it would have been for your daughter with the plunger.
Yeah.
And yet that was, we have these things, our body, there's a great book by Vessel van der Kolk about trauma, The Body Keeps Score. It's an old expression, and it's like your body remembers, and with good reason, it creates this radar system that is going to protect you from the next time that you could be in an experience like that. And yeah, so I think that's right. There are these little victories, and then there are these big victories when you can get past, a fear like that. And that did happen. I was on a hike in the Sierras, and, I had been working towards this, and I came across a rattlesnake. There he was.
Wow.
And he's about 4.5 feet long, and I knew from what I had learned, they can only strike about half their length. So I was about 6 feet away, which is close to a rattlesnake.
Yeah.
But I intellectually knew I was safe, and I had done enough of my work to know that, I felt that kind of rush in my body. But then there was like a part of me that was there now, and this was through therapy, that allowed me to remember, you see, it's okay. Just stand here until this feeling in your body goes away, and trust that you'll be safe and okay. And sure enough, I was, and the rattlesnake got away from me. And I even got a little bit bold and kind of moved towards him as he was exiting, and sort of poked him with my hiking stick, and he made a beeline. He went, and something in my body said, you have power, you are stronger, he's afraid of you. And I'm not afraid of him any longer. So there is this hope, right? But you have to go through this process, right? And kind of like get your body to understand itself, and get the self-judgment out of the way.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I love what you had said, Stacy, about taking the judgment out. And now you just mentioned it too, because without figuring out a way to be vulnerable and really understanding, or at least being able to open ourselves up to the fact that there is fear, and that the anxiety is around fear, because sometimes I think we have this concept that equals weakness, or fear equals something. And that's the belief, right? That's one of the beliefs that comes up, that my anxiety is a weakness. And I think that if we can actually see as human beings that fear is a normal reaction, anxiety is a normal reaction, and what we need to do is be vulnerable enough to look at what those fears are. That's the first step, because sometimes we don't even know what our anxiety is about, just like to your point earlier.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the vulnerability is a big piece of that too.
Yeah, and I realized that I started to ask about the beliefs, and we kind of have migrated. I wonder, what are some of those beliefs that you all are encountering? Obviously, my belief that snakes are dangerous and are more powerful than me, and like that's what that came down to. Like they'll every time. Right. But like, I guess I wonder what you notice about how people develop beliefs and conclusions about the nature of reality that comes out of those fears that they experienced.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna, if it's okay, I would love to
Please.
build on what you said, Andrea, because it was really, really struck a chord with me. Like, yes, it's so true. I've noticed that sometimes I'll encounter clients who have a belief that they can just, go through life fine without having to be vulnerable to exploring what those fears might be, or what those more underlying emotions might be. That they've gotten along this fine, and that's one part of them that kind of believes, like, why should I have to re-feel my feelings? I already went through it once. Why do I have to feel it again? But then there's this other part of them that knows that something is really wrong. Otherwise, they wouldn't be coming for therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about, like, how do we balance that that conflict so that people can start to challenge that belief that they hold, that, if I sit here and feel my feelings in a session, that's kind of like sappy, and I'm not a sappy person, and I don't want to do that, and I've avoided that long enough. There's that avoidance, and I've been okay. So there is a challenge there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a challenge, and it's not something that is easy to take on one's own. And I think that that's a lot of our role as a therapist, is helping invite people to just be open to giving that a shot. That there might be some value to going back in there and getting back in touch again with what those more vulnerable feelings are.
Yeah.
In order
So,
to
like,
understand.
so some real negative beliefs form about vulnerability itself,
Yeah.
and about of allowing ourselves to go back and revisit certain emotions that are connected to key events. Yeah,
Right.
I definitely noticed that one. I see that, and that's kind of a belief that gets in the way of treatment in some ways. We're always working with our clients to kind of negotiate, like, well, what if we could go back there and it wouldn't devastate you like it did when it actually happens? What if we could help you find a way to go back there sort of with some anesthesia, actually, so that it's not so intense, so that you could actually benefit from it, right? So we have our way of dealing with that one.
Boy, that's a really cool analogy, thinking about, like, what is that anesthesia? I love that, you see.
Mhm.
Could be a lot of different things. It could be just having the presence of somebody that you feel is in your court,
Yeah.
or just having the luxury of uninterrupted time and quiet and no other distractions.
Mhm.
Those things can all be kind of an anesthesia, or like a support system, scaffolding, as you walk through that process.
Mhm.
Super cool.
Yeah. Andrea, do you want to weigh in on the kinds of beliefs and conclusions that people start to form about reality or relationships that come out of anxious?
Yeah, I think when the first thing I think of when I think of beliefs that are really centered in a place of, I would say, irrational, even though that makes me feel a little uncomfortable to use that word, but they're irrational because some of these beliefs come down to, like, I'm not lovable, it's my fault,
Mm.
it's their fault, it's I'm not worthy, that there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with them. I
I'm
mean,
not safe.
I'm not safe.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, the list goes on and on about that, and to figure out what it is, with each person, it really is very related to what their trauma originally was. And
Yeah.
so, those are so deep and ingrained in us. And I think it also depends from a cultural perspective too. I just have to throw that part in, for for our society, the way that we have it, it's a lot of I'm not lovable or I'm not worthy and things like that. And then from other cultures, sometimes it's my whole culture doesn't think of me this way, or um, I'm looked at in this poor light, and that is what's super impactful and takes them down that road of anxiety. And so really coming to terms with what is it for you and for you personally? What are those beliefs that get in the way of thinking that you're safe, you're lovable, you're worthy, you're able to be productive in the world? What is getting in the way of that?
Yeah, it's so interesting as I hear you talk. It's like we started off this conversation about like, what is the difference between anxiety and PTSD? And maybe the answer is it's sort of a matter of extreme. That's maybe what the difference is. They're on a continuum. But now we're starting to get into, and what's the implication of having untreated anxiety and PTSD? Well, if you're me, you were afraid to take a hike out in the desert because of snakes. If it's Stacy's daughter, you couldn't go into a public restroom, But I think what we're starting to get into now, when you start to list those beliefs that you just listed there, Andrea, we start to get into the kinds of beliefs that make connection and intimacy really difficult. If I'm not worthy and it's always my fault, or I'm not enough and I have to always behave in order to please people, or I'm never safe and no one will protect me, that's really going to affect how a person behaves when they start getting closer to another person that they love. It's going to come out in ways, it's going to show up. And it may surprise them, but it's sure going to surprise other people. And when those other people are adults, they at least have some choice in whether they stay in that relationship. But when those other people are little children, they don't. And so these negative beliefs about oneself, or about one's life, or about one's place in a family, I think we should probably do a whole show just on how negative beliefs that flow out of these anxieties and PTSD experiences in life impact relationships, impact marriages and parenting. We would probably do 2 more shows.
Yeah.
One on marriage and one on parenting, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Say a little bit more about that. You both have experienced what I'm talking about in your work with clients, right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So many times when I'm working with a couple, for example, because I've got more experience working with couples than families, but when we're able to identify ways that the couple gets stuck, like patterns that they get stuck in, their routine, habitual kind of reactions to one another, and how that feeds off of one another. So many times, if we really slow that down, and if it becomes difficult to slow that down without becoming really flooded with emotion for one or both of the partners, that's usually an indication to me that there's some unresolved relational trauma from the past that's coming into play. And if we can hold space for that, and if the client can come to look at that as, oh, okay, there's nothing wrong with me because I'm getting stuck and flooded. It just means actually we can celebrate that now we've identified a new place to work. And if we can go in there and unravel that, then that can really advance the potential to stop being so disconnected and start building towards connection. But oftentimes it's not something that they're aware of coming in.
Yeah, it's like they come in with relational problems, and we do our work and get back to negative beliefs that they hold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so what could some of those negative beliefs be? It could be that, no matter what I do, I'm never going to get it right. Or I really am not worthy of being close, or it is not safe for me to allow someone else in because they're not going to like me. I'm going to be rejected. I'm not good enough.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then so if a person just even holds the I'm not good enough, then we'll discover them feeling that at some point in the relationship, and either feeling rejected by another person when the other person's not rejecting them.
Yeah.
Or doing something to be good enough in order to earn the other person's love, and yet the other person's not asking them to do that.
Right. And then they can't understand why that doesn't earn them the love that they assumed that it would.
And they become resentful, and and then the spouse is going like, why are you resentful? And then the person feels like, well, you're not validating me because I am, and oh boy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to go back to the original topic, that's all coming from anxiety, of that anxiety around not being lovable, not being good enough. Mm-hmm. And so then you immediately would go into your reactive behavior associated with your reaction to anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so learning about how we respond to our anxiety. And that's why I brought up anger a couple of times. There can be shutting down and just going, you know what? I'm not good enough, to your point when you said I'm just going to be rejected if I show them who I am. So I'm not going to show them who I am. And I'm going to shut down. So there's so many different behaviors that we do in response to our anxiety that then affect the way that we can communicate with our spouse or with our children or with our parents or whatever those relationships are. It's not isolated to those two sets, Mm-hmm. We have our patterns with probably anyone that we feel close to in our lives. So,
totally.
And I love how you're saying that, because you brought up implicit and explicit memories. And I think a lot of these things that you're just describing are implicit or explicit. Sometimes I know that I was told I was worthless, and I know that I am feeling that way in this relationship, and I know that I am hiding, mm-hmm. my feelings, because they won't, I don't matter, so why share them? Other times, though, there's this implicit thing that happened in our lives. We learned something but don't remember learning whatever it was, and it shows up in our marriage or in our parenting, or like even with our own folks as adults. And we don't really quite know why we're holding back. We may not even be aware that we are hiding or holding back or, not being vulnerable, because it's, our brain is sort of up there functioning to protect us the whole time. And yet we don't even know that we are feeling a threat and protecting ourselves. It's so, boy, we could do so many shows, a show on explicit and implicit, and like how it is that we don't understand ourselves, right?
Absolutely. That's a big conversation about the brain, really,
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm making some notes as we do this, and I wonder, it's time to wrap up here. I think we've been going about an hour or so, and I wonder if there's any final thoughts that either of you have that you'd like to share about our discussion here today, and all the different points we've touched on, and have the last word.
You go ahead, Andrea.
Have a last word.
Yeah, I was just going to say, really, I'm just thankful that we're creating this space to talk about it, because I think that's the first step in all of this, is being able to acknowledge, yes, I have anxiety. Yes, I'm concerned about it. And yes, I don't know what to do. And so just to be able to have this space to have this conversation, I'm hoping can be helpful.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
I love that. I would also like to add that just because we're therapists doesn't mean that we're immune to anxiety. And there have been plenty of times where lately I've put into my own life some of the skills that I've learned in my training that I help people with. And one of those is when I find myself in anxiety, I allow myself to recognize that it's there. And I actually say to myself in my head, hello, anxiety. I see that you're there and you have a good reason for being there.
That reminds me of that wonderful movie with Russell Crowe, A Beautiful Mind,
Oh,
where
yeah.
he learns, he's a schizophrenic, and he learns to see his hallucinations as parts of himself that he can acknowledge.
Cool.
And at the end of the movie, he acknowledges each one and sort of nods to them, but continues on with his life. And in some strange way, they don't pester him.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's very
Right?
profound.
Love that.
So now I have a new movie to watch because I haven't seen that.
Oh,
Oh, yes, you do. You need to watch
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, but that's so true. It's such an empowering freedom to be able to acknowledge that something is there and then to allow it to be there without judging it as bad, because all of a sudden you've taken the unknown and the danger out of it.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I just want to thank you both so much. I get a lot out of these talks, and it's such a pleasure to work with you both, and to hear how you think and to see your minds, wrestling with these matters. For those viewers or listeners who are new to us, New Growth Counseling Services offers marriage and family therapy. We mostly do relationship work here, but we focus a lot on trauma, because just about every relational problem we deal with has something like what we talked about today. Some kind of a fear or an anxiety or a trauma that's either normal or disordered or extreme, as in PTSD. And Andrea, I have the benefit of working with Andrea and Stacy and being along for their journey as they've been growing in this field and working with people. And we talk about cases in our supervision group where we really try hard to figure out how to help people who are struggling with these matters here. And so it's really neat to hear you both kind of step into your strengths and your authority as people to be reckoned with, who have thought about these matters and take them seriously enough to make a career out of trying to tackle and help tame the inner anxieties and the inner voices and then the body itself that's freaking out. So
Yeah.
wonderful
You.
to be with you
Thank
both.
you.
Feels like
You
an honor
too.
to be here. Yeah, I'm really grateful for
Absolutely.
this time and this space.
And so a shameless plug, you just go ahead and get in touch with us at newgrowthcounseling.com, and you can click on any one of our pages and access us directly and ask us questions. We're more than happy to respond to that. And if you're needing therapy or interested in being a client, just go to our webpage and you can find us there, newgrowthcounseling.com, licensed in California, doing telehealth during the pandemic. So as long as you're in California, we can work with you.